Hello, my name is Cody Price, and I just want to welcome everyone. It is now 1 o'clock, so we'll begin our presentation shortly. Today, on June 3rd, we will have a presentation on livable communities, sustainable regions, how transportation investments shape our development patterns, given by Chris Sinclair and Hannah Twaddell. For help during today's webcast, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, or call 1-800-263-6317. For content questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box, and we'll be able to answer those at the end of the presentation during our question and answer session. Here's a list of our participating chapters, divisions, and universities, and I just want to send a personal thank you out to the APA Virginia chapter for sponsoring today's session. For our upcoming webcast, our next one will be on June 10th on real estate finance from simple to complex, and then we'll have another one on June 17th and June 24th. And then as of right now, we have a Lone Ranger in July on July 15th on community erosion. And you'll be able to find a complete listing for our 2011 webcasts at www.utah-apa.org/webcast, and you will also be able to choose your webcast of choice and register for it at this site. To log your CM credits for attending today's session, you'll need to go to www.planning.org/CM, select activities by date, and then underneath Friday, June 3rd, you'll see Livable Communities, Sustainable Regions, and this is up. So after the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll be able to go to this website and claim today's credits, and it is for 1.5 CM credits. And then afterwards, you'll be able to find a PDF and video recording of today's webinar at www.utah-apa.org/webcast-archive, and this should be up by Monday. If you happen to miss this, I will be going over this at the end of today's session. So if you don't have time to write it down, you can write it down, the web address down then. So at this time, I would now like to hand it over to Glenn Larson, who will be introducing our speakers for today.
Thanks, Cody. Once again, welcome to this afternoon's APA Chapter webcast, Livable Communities, Sustainable Regions, How Transportation Investments Shape Our Development Patterns. I'm Glenn Larson, AICP Professional Development Officer for the APA Virginia Chapter. The APA Virginia Chapter is sponsoring today's webcast. I'll also be moderating questions at the end of the presentation. So as you have questions, go ahead and send them in, and we'll try to get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Our presenters are Chris Sinclair and Hannah Twaddell with the Renaissance Planning Group. The Renaissance Planning Group is a planning, design, and policy analysis consulting firm that works with cities, regions, states, and federal agencies to integrate transportation, land use, urban design, and technology. Headquartered in Orlando, Florida, the firm has offices in Tampa, South Florida, Tallahassee, as well as Charlottesville, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Chris Sinclair has more than 25 years of experience managing a variety of land and transportation planning projects. As founder and president of Renaissance Planning Group, Chris is a visionary leader committed to advancing the art and science of planning practice by integrating disparate disciplines, methods, and approaches to produce meaningful plans, policies, and tools. Chris has managed master plans, transportation studies, comprehensive plan updates, metropolitan planning organizations' long-range transportation plan updates, impact fee, and concurrency ordinances and fiscal impact studies. He is well-versed in a wide range of planning tools and methods, including land use models, travel demand models, traffic operations software, and fiscal impact models. One of the many unique technical tools and methods Chris has created is CorePlan, a GIS-based scenario planning model that many communities and regions have used to craft a shared vision for future development. Chris joins us from the Renaissance Planning Group's offices in Orlando. Hannah Twaddell has 23 years of experience in regional and local planning, with an emphasis on integrating transportation, land use, community design, and public participation. Prior to joining Renaissance in 2001, Hannah served 14 years as Chief Transportation Planner for the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission and Charlottesville-Albemarle MPO in Virginia. Hannah's regional planning work includes award-winning scenario planning and visioning processes for communities such as Binghamton, New York, Lynchburg, Virginia, Midland, Texas, and Waco, Texas, as well as context-sensitive corridor plans and design guidelines. She has developed a variety of educational resources and tools for state and federal agencies, including an online smart transportation toolkit from the Montana Department of Transportation, a multi-day course on land use and transportation planning for the National Highway and Transit Institutes, and an AARP webinar on designing complete streets for older adults. A prolific writer and popular speaker, Hannah writes a regular column for the nationally distributed Planning Commissioners Journal. Hannah joins us from the Renaissance Planning Group's offices in Charlottesville, Virginia. You can reach both Chris and Hannah through their website, www.citysetwork.com. Welcome, Chris and Hannah. I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Well, thank you, Glenn, and we are just delighted to be with you today, and I will confirm now that indeed that is the picture of me disguised as Hannah Montana. It was taken in Yellowstone a couple of years ago. Not too out of date. My hair does still kind of look like that. So a few questions that's really spurred our decision to come and greet with you and meet with you all today that have been rattling around in our heads for quite a long time that we'd like to try to share some thoughts with you about as we move through the webinar today. How does transportation really affect community livability and sustainability? What are the linkages between accessibility and mobility and development? And how can we shape transportation systems that will make us all thrive, not only today, but for generations to come? The word livability is perhaps one in the series of words that we try to use to describe what it is we planners are trying to do in this world, create communities that are not only livable, but I think much better than that. However, this is the current word, and a current definition of livability that's coming from the federal sector includes 6 basic principles regarding transportation choices, equitable housing, economic competitiveness, investing in existing communities, leveraging federal policies and investments, and valuing urban, suburban, and rural communities and neighborhoods. These principles were crafted by a partnership between Department of Housing and Urban Development, Environmental Protection Agency, and USDOT that was formed a couple of years ago now and has been working very hard to try to advance these concepts across those 3 federal agencies, as well as introducing them and pushing them across the federal government and throughout communities in America as a way to really make our places better. On a related note, the concept of sustainability and the word sustainability has been around a little longer, as some of you may know as planners. A definition that's been working for 20 or 30 years for sustainability is to meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And the sort of 3-legged stool or overlapping circles, or however you want to define it, that really underlie the concept of sustainability is making sure that you have plans and systems and communities that simultaneously balance preservation of the environment with advancement of the economy and an equitable society. So how do you take those kinds of concepts and principles and specifically address them in transportation plans and investments? Traditionally, this issue that's on the screen now has been the issue, which is that agencies have been trying to do it for quite a long time, but there's no real standardized practice for integrating livability and sustainability concepts and goals into transportation. Agencies have really been struggling for a long time now to really make these relationships clear and explicit. And what we hope to do today is share with you some of the emerging ideas and thoughts and really exciting things that are going on across the country, starting from that federal scale with USDOT's interest in livability, with Federal Transit Administration's interest in livability and sustainability, and with the Federal Highway Administration's interest. All 3 agencies, USDOT of course has served an umbrella for more agencies than that, have really been trying very hard to craft resources for planners, transportation planners, and land use planners that can help us achieve this goal of really affecting livability positively through transportation. This little quote is from a guidebook published very recently by Federal Highways that we had a chance to work on along with our consultant partner ICF to help define and provide case studies and best practices not only for incorporating livability into transportation investments and systems and plans, but also to address the longer-term issues of sustainability, which is, in one definition, you could say it's really livability for future generations. And this guidebook is just one example of many that are out there that are being created by transportation-related agencies throughout the administration, many of which are just a sampling are seen on your screen, and many of which are being funded by a variety of agencies, including ones that are not coming out of DOT, including EPA and HUD particularly. So I think this is a really golden opportunity for us as planners to really begin to integrate our transportation planning, our funding, our sources, our best practices with the larger practice of urban planning, regional planning, rural planning, and really address the whole question of creating communities that people want to live in. So that makes me step back and say, why do people live in community? What was the purpose of getting together in the first place? And I think initially the goal was to survive, and I think that is still true today. But as our societies have advanced, we also gather in community to thrive. And so transportation needs to help us survive, and the way it does that is providing us connections that help us get our basic needs met in a way that supports our health and our well-being. But transportation also needs to help us thrive, which has to do with economic well-being, with healthy living, and with advancing our sort of social, spiritual, educational goals of life. Connections for transportation can help or hinder us depending on their quality. The other question that's on the table here when we're looking at integrating livability and transportation is asking, well, why do people travel? One reason is to get stuff. Another reason is just to have fun. And many times it's kind of both. If anybody's ever taken a road trip on Route 66 or somewhere else, we know this. Traveling really is a blend of activity that is essential to human life. And some of you may know this, but I think there's a generally conventionally accepted point that human beings across the world and throughout all time typically travel about 90 minutes a day. And if all they do is walk, they don't go as far as people who drive. But generally, people want to travel, and we need to support travel that allows people to achieve the purpose of the trips, get the stuff they need, make the exchanges they need, but also to enjoy the experience of traveling, to have it be something that's safe, that's easy to navigate, whether or not you can drive, for example, in many communities, and that does not harm the environment and allows us to spend appropriate time, 90 minutes a day, not too much more, and not necessarily too much less if we don't want to. The third question I have before I turn it over to Chris that I just wanted to lay out as an opening premise is to think about what makes a community. And again, I'm thinking here about what is it that transportation brings to the table when a community is created. And it's right up front. Transportation really is a fundamental element that frames all communities. The natural landscape and the accessibility created by rivers, by roads, by railroads really establish a framework for any community anywhere in the world, which then weaves a fabric. The people in that community create a fabric of buildings and parks and local connections. And from that fabric that's woven onto that framework, we get a unique fingerprint of every community. Every community is shaped very, very distinctly by the natural systems, as shown here in the little town of Orange, Virginia, by the transportation systems that get overlaid over time into the canyons and rivers and valleys and rail lines and so forth, and then the settlement patterns that tend to organize themselves around those transportation networks. Where things are most accessible is where development wants to go. And in turn, the scale of those streets and networks really dictate the built form. A large framework of large streets and street grids, as Chris will be talking about in a minute, are going to give you a fairly large-scale community. A small scale of fine-grained streets is going to give you a much finer-grained scale community, and it will ultimately really contribute heavily to the character of that community, and you can really see the character of a community changing and evolving very closely in step with the quality and the type and the scale of its transportation networks. Chris is going to talk a little bit more about that concept and some of the science behind it, and I'll turn it over to you, Chris, to discuss that a little further.
All right. I'm going to start by talking about the building blocks of urban places, place types, a hierarchy of place types and street networks, and then corridors, and then I'm going to talk about what we think are the fundamental planning and design goals, which are ensuring that both mode sheds and destinations overlap, and that network continuity is provided at all levels and all scales. So starting out with place types, what we have done just to get this area introduced, these are transect-based place types. I think a lot of people are familiar with them. They go all the way from T1 natural zone up to a T6 urban core downtown zone with a hierarchy of place types in between the two. There's also special district zones which include warehousing and retail, big box retail and industrial uses. Next slide. These place types are defined in the SMART code. These are some general characteristics of the place types. Next slide. Hannah, there we go. What's not clear when you look at the SMART code and Transect information is, what are the details of the transportation network that underlie these different place types? If you look at the SMART code, they do talk about pedestrian sheds, which are quarter-mile radius, half-mile in diameter. There's a primary pedestrian shed. I think there's also a secondary pedestrian shed that extends out another quarter mile to create a mile diameter area. And then there's a third bike shed that's somewhere between 2 and 4 miles in diameter. So those are showing up on your screen as the pink, the dark pink, the pink, and the yellow. And then there's also a hierarchy of streets that serve differing market areas. There's through streets for regional and interregional travel. There's commute connectors to try to get to work, market connectors to get to local retail, and neighborhood streets that allow you to get through the neighborhood itself. And just to give you some examples of place types, these are focused on Virginia. This is downtown Richmond, Virginia. What you're seeing in the aerial photograph is the primary pedestrian shed with that smaller circle. That's the half-mile diameter walk area. The secondary shed circle surrounds that. That's the mile in diameter. So the circle represents, and this is going to be pretty consistent through my presentation, the circle represents about a square mile in area. In downtown Richmond, if you can see on the aerial photograph, is pretty much fully contained within that mile area. It is a fairly large building footprints are in downtown Richmond, so it's a T6 type of zone. Next slide. And then moving down the scale on the next slide is downtown Charlottesville, not as big of an urban area. Downtown Charlottesville is much more like an urban center. The building heights aren't as big. It is primarily non-residential in character. What's interesting about downtown Charlottesville is because the Charlottesville region is smaller than Richmond, what's in downtown Charlottesville is pretty much contained within that primary pedestrian shed. And since downtown Charlottesville was put together before cars were invented, it is a very walkable place. Next slide. The next area is Ghent district in Norfolk, Virginia. It would be considered a general urban zone because it is more residential in character, but it does have a lot of good urban form and urban bones to it. Most of what people would consider to be Ghent lies within that quarter mile, half mile primary pedestrian shed. Next slide. The next area is just on the outskirts of Lynchburg, Virginia. And what's interesting about this is suburban place type, which is T3, is that there's a fairly ubiquitous landform within the entire mile circle. All of the footprints that you see in the aerial photograph, or just about all of them, are single-family residential areas. So if you're going to walk within this particular area, The destinations that you would walk to would be other houses, but that's typically not what people walk to. So even though these are walkable places in terms of functional walking, it's not the place that provides that. And then Glenn probably would recognize this area. It's the Brandywine area of Chesterfield, which is more rural in character, and you can see the flavor of it. Next slide. And the last zone is the Special District Zone. This is a place in Virginia Beach. It's where Lynnhaven Mall is. It's right off of Lynnhaven Road in Virginia Beach. A lot of activity. You can see a lot of footprints within the aerial photograph, a lot of activity within that mile circle. But it's mostly non-residential activity, so not a lot of walking because of the lack of destinations occurs within this area. But more importantly, it's not well connected, and because it's not well connected, it's not as easy as it would appear to be to get from one front door to the next front door as you go through this area. Next slide. So place types and networks, they're connected, and they form a hierarchy. And I want to go through a fairly quick representation of what that hierarchy looks like, starting with travel sheds. If we could get everybody into a very small space, then we wouldn't have to travel very far. But the fact is, we do spread out over space, and because of that, we have different travel sheds that are generally recognizable. The first is a neighborhood shed, getting to the park or to the school. The next is a market shed, what I call a market shed, which is getting to the drugstore or grocery store. The commute shed typically is a little bit longer because you're getting to work, which tends to be a little bit further away. Then there's regional sheds, such as the trip to downtown if you don't live in downtown, or that regional destination. And then the last is interregional, which is travel among regions in the country. Walkable neighborhoods are at the base of the hierarchy, and these are all based on a quarter-mile primary walk area that I talked about earlier. Next slide. They should be connected by a series of streets to form the neighborhood grid. Next slide. The commute corridor centers this cluster of neighborhoods together. You can see it's a couple of crossroads, and transit, it's very appropriate on that. And then you've got the regional access that's being provided by the through street, which is typically an expressway. And then on top of that, you've got a series of sub-streets, market connectors that get you to a smaller series of centers. Next slide. And so the centers start orienting themselves to this network. So you have, at the smallest level, the parks and schools and things like that are neighborhood centers that serve the neighborhoods themselves very directly. Then on top of that, at the next level, you have town centers, a smaller set of centers. And on top of that, you've got the larger center, which is the regional center. And you also have these things called Twaddell areas, which provide opportunities for high accessibility because of their location next to expressways. So that's a very conceptual, highlighted, high-level diagram of what the system would look like in terms of the hierarchy in the travel markets. And then how that starts forming across the landscape. So you've got the regional environmental landscape, next slide, that you try to protect at a landscape level. Next slide. Try to connect all these features together. Next slide. And one way of understanding how form should fit on this landscape is to put that grid on top of the landform and then start modifying that grid. Next slide. So that the alignments minimize their impacts to this landscape network. Next slide. And within that framework, that network, come the neighborhoods and those pedestrian sheds. Next slide. And then the public and green spaces that help frame up and form those urban areas. Next slide. And then where all those larger streets in the network intersect start informing you in terms of where the center should take place. Next slide. And then lastly, corridors. Corridors are places where there is a lot of high-intensity travel taking place. There's also a lot of high-intensity development that's usually taking place. Next slide. And in the Transect diagram itself, there's an implication of corridors. You can see the in the top diagram is that Transect diagram that we started with in the different place types. What you're seeing on the bottom is just a network representation of the same thing, adding some detail about how the network should form up around these transect zones. So there's a direct correlation between the top graphic and the bottom graphic. Next slide. And the transect, as it implies, it goes from fairly high density in the downtown area and it transitions into lower densities. The transition, though, isn't always smooth. There's typically subcenters within larger areas where there is some additional density. Next slide. And the way corridors get put together can be very different. So, Hannah, where are you here? Next slide, please. Hello?
Sorry, it's a little stuck. Not sure why. There we go.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got it.
Okay.
So what I'm showing, I'm going to show just a series of differing corridor types, and they're all predicated on, again, these circles. The outer edges of these circles represent a mile diameter. So we're going to be looking at a series of places using 3 circles joined together. So it's about a 3x1 area that we're looking, 3x1 mile area that we're looking at. What we're seeing on the screen right now is downtown Washington, D.C., and the footprints within all 3 of those circles are fairly big. It's a very intense place. It is the core of the region, and it's pretty extensive and pretty big. So this is a very high-intensity urban corridor. Next slide. There's another form of corridor. This is actually in Arlington, Virginia, just on the other side of the Potomac River from downtown Washington, D.C. Arlington is organized, at least this corridor is organized along the Orange Line, Metro Orange Line coming out of Washington, D.C. And what you see within that 3-mile area is a lot of intensity right along the Orange Line stations itself and the alignment itself. But unlike Washington, D.C., the big building footprints, as you get further away from the stations, start dropping off into fairly low intensities. But right in that primary pedestrian shed area, the inner circle, there are very high densities within this corridor, so it would be a high-intensity, transit-oriented development corridor. Next slide. The next slide is a very classic transect kind of looking place. This is Richmond again. The circle in the bottom right of the green of the aerial photograph is downtown Richmond, which we saw before, the most intense part of Richmond region. And then the middle circle is an urban center. The densities get a little bit lower here. Virginia Commonwealth University is located in this area. Some of the museums in Richmond are located in this area. It's a little bit more residential in flavor, but still a pretty good mix between residential and non-residential. The densities, as I said, drop off. And then when you get to the next circle to the northwest, the upper left, it becomes much more residential in character. It's the Fan District. But it's still got very good bones and very good urban structure to it. Next slide. So that's an idea of the different flavors of corridors and how they can be organized, and there's a lot of variations to corridors and how they're put together. What I want to do is I want to start shifting into planning and design goals, and the first one I want to talk about is creating mode shed and destination overlap. Next slide. Again, using that same diagram that we've been looking at, if you could hit the down button. This is my animation screen here, Hannah. Again, the primary pedestrian shed in the dark pink. In the lighter pink, secondary pedestrian bike shed, and then what's being superimposed on top of all this, if you hit it again, is the transit shed. And the transit shed is formed primarily by what's accessible from the transit stations, and you want to minimize accessibility to transit stations by automobiles and by other cars because it introduces a transfer which is a real impediment to travel. Next slide. I'm going to go through some examples here just to give you an idea of the importance of overlap. So in this particular example, let's assume we've got a young married couple, and they live in a house that's located where that yellow dot is on the screen, on the lower middle left part of the screen. And they're deciding on one Friday night to go out and eat dinner. And they've looked at their restaurant app, and they've decided, or they found that there's 10 potential restaurants within relatively close proximity of their house. Those are represented by the red dots on this particular map. Now, in terms of where they go and how they get there, they're going to start factoring in, where is the place and what are the travel options for getting to those places. So there's one place that's right next to them, within walking distance, and they'll likely walk to that place. There's another, if you look just to the southwest of that yellow dot, there's another restaurant that's a little bit more of a walk, but it's a nice gridded network, and they'll probably take the walk to that. And there's a dot to the northeast of them that's in the yellow area within the bike shed. They may walk there, or they may take a bike to get there. But then if you look at the rest of the destinations, they're beyond the walking distance or even a bicycle distance. There is no transit provided in this particular scenario, so they're likely going to get in their car to get to the one of the remaining 7 restaurants. So there's in terms of restaurant destinations, only 30% of the destinations are accessible by a non-auto mode. Next slide. Now let's say it's a year later and they're trying to make the same trip. The restaurants are in the same spot, but now the jurisdiction has built a nice light rail system with a stop real close to their house. They still have the 3 restaurants that are within walking and biking distance, but now if they get on transit and they go to the next station up to the right, there's 3 more restaurants that are within walking distance of that station. And if they go further to the east, to the next station, there's yet another restaurant within walking distance of that station. So now they've got 4 additional destinations, restaurants, that are accessible by non-auto mode. And only 3 of the 10 they had to get in the car to go to. So you can see the richness of their destinations has increased significantly by adding this transit system for them to take. Next slide.
I just want you to base this more in reality, Chris, because if a community could build this in 1 year, we'd be living on another planet. However, in the 30 years it took them to build that, the couple aged to the point where they need transit, and it's there for them. So there you go. They can age in place.
So next slide.
You got it.
Okay. And let's assume, rather than it took them more than a year, but let's assume that rather than put that transit alignment along the blue corridor near their house, what they did was they put the transit alignment up in the regional through corridor. Same station spacing as in the previous example, but because the transit station is so far away from the house, it would take a lot of time it would be hard to walk from the house up to the station. It would take a lot of time just to get to the next station and back down to the restaurant. So basically this transit alignment has done them and the restaurants absolutely no good in terms of non-auto travel. So they're back where they started in terms of their non-auto accessibility. Next slide. And the last example that I'm going to go through in the series, let's assume that the local land use codes don't support putting a lot of intensity and density in around these stations and in pedestrian areas. So what happens over time is a lot of those restaurants that are shown in the lighter pink colors close up and new restaurants open up, and so the viable range of restaurants shown in the dark red dots are scattered as you see on the screen here. This is what happens when you don't make land use and transportation compatible, and there's a lack of overlap between your land use policies and your transit and transportation investments. In this example, what's happened is the number of transit trips, rather than being 4, has been reduced to 2. They've lost that favorite restaurant right next door to them, so they've lost their non-auto accessibility because of the lack of overlap. So the bottom line, next slide. The bottom line is you want to create as much overlap in terms of your mode sheds and your destinations as you possibly can. This is where the 4 Ds really come into play. Density, diversity, design, and destinations. This is how it all comes together. And if you can get all these things together, there really is, there's evidence out there that there's a lot of synergy in the overlap, and you get a great big boost in the amount of non-auto travel when you can get these things to overlap properly. Next slide. The importance of continuity is the second goal that I want to go through, major goal. Next slide. Back to that same diagram. If you remember, there's different market sheds, and then there's different transportation facilities that serve those market sheds. The purple lines in this are the through streets or the regional streets serving that regional, interregional market. The commute streets are in the darker blue. They provide connectivity within the corridor on a shorter travel scale. The even smaller streets provide that access to even more localized markets, and then the white streets are the local streets. Transit also operates in that fashion, where you've got commute transit. Typically, it's some sort of premium transit. At least it's fixed bus route transit, and then shuttle transit service is typically provided for the more localized markets. Next slide. There we go. And this is, I'm back to downtown Richmond and that Transect in Richmond, and this is still just a fascinating place. I used to live there, and I loved living there because of its livability. But you can see the 3 circles of pedestrian sheds, and what's interesting about Richmond is the major through streets, which are I-95 and I-64. They form an edge of the pedestrian area, so they don't bisect these places. They help shape these places. And then you see in the lighter blue streets that are shown on the map, this network, and it's a very connected network of higher level market and commute shed streets that provide the more localized access into this area. And then it's not, but you can sort of see the pattern in the aerial photograph. There's yet the local streets that provide a real strong complement to the larger connector streets that go through this particular area. So there's a lot of just real easy and fit together well continuity that's being provided by the entire network that goes through this particular area. The red line that you see on the map is a proposed bus rapid transit alignment that's going to go along Broad Street. And you can see it was easy to superimpose that into this particular fabric and into this network because it was connected together properly. So the continuity happens at all levels. It happens at the local level, the market street level, the commute street level, as well as the connector street, the through street level. Next slide. The next place is, I think most people are familiar with it. If you're not, it's an interesting area. It's called Tyson's Corner. It's up in the Washington, D.C. area. It's in the suburbs. It's right off of 295. Just looking at it, the initial impression is that, well, you've got the through streets in purple that provide the edges. There's one through street that kind of bisects this place. But then when you get down below the through street level, the connectivity, the network connectivity at the commute level and at the market level is gone. There's these series of streets that kind of flow through here, but there's no pattern to them. There's no spacing like you saw in Richmond. And then even more damaging for the connectivity of this place is the local grid. There is no local grid that helps support the connector streets. And so the pedestrian sheds, same scale as downtown Richmond, are not as evident because of the patterns, because of the lack of network connectivity. And what they're proposing to do in this particular area is extend the metro line. The purple line will come through this area. And it's been a somewhat of a challenge for them to get that alignment through here. It's going to happen. When it does happen, it's going to improve this area quite a bit. But they've had to go in and redesign this area to try to get it to be more walkable, more network continuity, and more overlap of the mode sheds and the destinations. In other words, to try to get this formed up to provide all the things that we've been talking about. Next slide.
And would that transit line, Chris, go where the red dotted line is, more or less?
Yeah, that's close to it, but not quite exactly there, but close to it.
Right. But it is sort of in between the two large thoroughfares that frame the region, which is good.
Yeah. Next slide. So I'm gonna this fascinating place, the Arlington Fairfax corridor. It's that corridor that comes out of Washington D.C. And just some of the lessons learned. We've done a detailed study of the corridor, and so I want to show you what we've learned as we've looked at it. This is the corridor. It extends on the very right side of the graphic. You see the Potomac River. So it's just the very right part of the screen is Roslyn, and then the purple area is Arlington itself, the city of Arlington, or the county of Arlington, I should say. Falls Church is in the green area, and then Fairfax County is in the brown and the golden areas. Each one of those circles that you see on the screen is a station area, the primary walk area, again, that quarter, half-mile circle diameter, and the larger circle is the secondary walk area, which is the mile circle. Next slide. So these are the stations along the way. Next slide. This is a profile of the densities along the corridor. So the different colors you see represent the different sub-areas. But you can clearly see the purple area to the right, the densities are extremely high. And you can see that notion of a transect as it moves from the area that's closest to Washington D.C. It starts fading fast once you get past Arlington. A little bit of density starts popping up in Fairfax as you get further out. Those are those subnodes that I talked about earlier with the Transect. Next slide. This is just a sort of oblique angle view of the same density contour just to show you the station areas themselves. One thing that Arlington did extremely well is they planned for overlap in their station areas. So they purposely and spent a lot of money putting the metro alignment underneath the ground, underneath and away from the big through street, which in this case was I-66. And if you look at the reds, red spikes that are coming up, those are densities within the primary walk area. You can see the densities drop off very quickly when you get into the blue areas, dark blue areas in those stations. But the same sort of spiking does not occur at all in the rest of the stations. In fact, the rest of the stations have very low densities around the stations themselves because they mainly are being impacted by the fact that those stations are in the I-66 corridor itself. Next slide. And then network continuity. You can see we're measuring, in this particular example, we're measuring network continuity through intersection density. And each one of those dots on the screen down below represents a different intersecting street. And you can see the densities of the intersecting streets are very high in Arlington, stay somewhat high when you get out into the Falls Church area, but then they start dropping off as you get further out into Arlington. Into Fairfax County. Next slide.
The other thing I notice in this one, Chris, is that there are very few intersections within the station areas as you get out into the suburban areas.
And
where you do have intersections that are outside of that circle.
And you'll see that in more detail in the next slide. I believe it's the next slide. The next slide is a representation of the densities, intersection densities, just to give you a sense of how that works out in terms of quantifying the network. Next slide. And this is what you were talking about, Hannah. This is a diagram of the network street footprint along the corridor, with the station areas highlighted in the black and white areas. So you can see the primary, secondary station pedestrian areas in the stations. And what's noticeable about that is when you, on the right side of the graphic, you can see I-66, which is the through street, does not go through the station areas. It edges the station areas, much like 95 and 64 did for the Fan District in Richmond, Virginia. And there's, if you look at the station areas, there's that real fine grid that Hannah was talking about within those station areas. Then when you get out to the Fairfax stations, you can see the big footprint that's imposed by I-66 in the station areas, which actually consumes quite a bit of land that could be used for destinations that can't be because the footprint, the street footprint's so big. And then the network around the stations and around I-66 itself is not as well connected. So you lose quite a bit of connectivity in those station areas as compared to the station areas in Arlington. Next slide. And the urban footprints, the building footprints themselves also tell a story. You can see the bigger footprints within the primary walk areas in Arlington. And by the way, that was intentionally planned by the city of Arlington. And then if you start looking at some of the other station areas, you see some big footprints, but mostly those footprints happen outside that primary walk area. Next slide. And this is just a blow up to show you what's going on in two of those station areas. The one on the right, you can see the big building footprints within the primary walk area. And then the one on the left, you see how much I-66 and the Dulles Toll Road really impact that particular station area. Next slide. And the proof is in the pudding. If the goal is to make places, you know, one of the livability goals from federal highways that, or U.S. Department of Transportation that Hannah mentioned earlier, was to increase travel choices. And if you really want to fundamentally increase travel choices, then you plan these places with a whole lot of overlap and a lot of continuity. And what this graph is showing is the mode splits that occur across this corridor. And when you're out in Fairfax, the mode splits are hard-pressed to get above 5%. This is the amount of transit trips. But once you get in Arlington itself, they zoom up to over 15%, which is pretty significant. So if you really want to fundamentally change travel patterns and provide travel choices, you need to think about the overlapping mode footprints as well as destinations. Next slide. And a way to potentially do this is to start, you know, add some more parameters to the transect concept and start maybe thinking about multimodal intensity zones where you have a certain set of requirements for the places where the most overlap occurs. So if you look on this diagram, that place, that pink place that's right next to a transit station that's walkable at the core of the bikeable area as well, it has the most overlap. So you need to design it properly. You need to get the highest densities in there. So target that as a high M1 intensity zone. And then you can sort of back off of those zones as you get further away from the overlap, and you get less overlap until you get down to the place where there's very little overlap at all, which is in this diagram the M4 zone down to the bottom right. Here you don't have a whole lot of options that are going to be provided to people in terms of travel modes. So this is where you can allow the network to get a little bit less dense, where land uses become a little less dense, where it is okay to have a more suburban kind of development going on.
And do those zones, Chris, correlate to the T1, T2, and so forth Transect zones?
Yes, they could. They certainly could. So. So that's actually I was going to say a nutshell. That was not a nutshell. I understand that, but that's an overview of that relationship between land use and transportation. So Hannah?
And I'm just going to sort of bring it back to kind of thinking about that framework and fabric and fingerprint concept that as we design our streets and our corridor networks, and keep in mind that a corridor isn't just a street or a transit line, it's a network through a swath of area that is an activity center or a zone or a place. And by linking up our streets and our corridors properly, we can really set the stage for good, complete communities. Most of you probably have heard of complete streets. It's certainly a concept now that's been around for quite a while, and basically it's just advocating making your street network accessible to all types of users. But really thinking again now about the fact that it doesn't mean that every single street is accessible to every single user. It's really more thinking about the corridors as a whole, the corridor networks as a whole, to take a place like the one that's showing on your screen now that is sort of as it was today or a couple years ago along a major highway in Albemarle County, Virginia, with big box development, and their vision for creating more of a grid network at a suburban scale here that allows the major street to be that sort of edge, that sort of through street, and begins to orient development into the activity center and create a place, essentially, that is bounded by the larger high mobility street, so that both freight and larger mobility travel has a place to go, but you also have a network that really supports the kind of community you want to have in the future. It's really understanding, as Chris was saying, the completeness of the entire network. So it's really balancing having your higher speed streets, your higher speed transit options that provide a lot of mobility with your decisions to locate activities in higher and higher levels of intensity and mix, and supplementing and supporting that proximity of activities with the accessibility within that place where you've got those activities going on. As Chris was saying, it's not enough just to put a transit station in if it's not in the right spot within your land use pattern, and it's not enough just to put a lot of density in if you haven't created a place that is easy to walk from within door to door by all types of people. It's really a matter of finding a balance between all three sort of levels of design, if you will, in order to make a community really work with a good, complete framework. I sometimes think about it just like designing a home, and I've thought a lot about barrier-free homes in the last few years especially. You need the speed to move around your house to get from one room to the next easily, from your dining room to your kitchen. Once you get to your kitchen, you want to have things located, the right things in the right proximity to one another. You want the food relatively near the place where you're going to cook it and so forth. And then when your things there and you've gotten to that room, you're going to want to be able to actually access the objects and the things you're trying to get to in a way that works for you. So designing a community perhaps isn't that different from designing a house when we think about it that way, and it's helpful to think about the kinds of people that are going to be using that community just like you would if you were designing a home. One of the strategies, interestingly, from architecture and from planning and from engineering that has evolved out of the three disciplines, particularly architecture and engineering, is this concept of context-sensitive solutions. And I'm going to just walk through very briefly now to wrap up these concepts behind this approach. I have found it very helpful. I've used this particular book a lot in some of my work with corridors and communities. It's been reflected, these concepts have been reflected in a fair number now of guidelines and resources, for instance, New Jersey DOT's Mobility and Community Forum Guidelines, and that graphic right there ought to look familiar to y'all. That's another adaptation of that very helpful Transect concept. Pennsylvania Department of Transportation has worked alongside New Jersey DOT with their own program, and many, many other state departments of transportation and federal agencies and local communities are beginning to use this sort of structured approach to designing the street and the built environment together so that you get the framework and the fabric that creates the kind of community you want. The approach, no matter sort of how you slice it, really comes down to a three-phase process. One is deciding what is the purpose of the given street or corridor or network you're trying to plan for. And some of the terminology there that goes into defining the purpose is the context zone, similar to transect zones, within which your study area is. What are the types of thoroughfares you're really going to be planning for? What needs to move through this kind of place that you're creating? Is it trucks? Is it bicycles? Is it people walking? And then what are the appropriate functional classifications of the corridors there? Once you've identified those, you can then begin to talk about scale, because the design speed, particularly of the vehicle that you're assuming is going to be using the corridors, different corridors, the most frequently, really drives everything else, literally and figuratively. So making good decisions about what's the right scale of each street type, and street within the place you're planning is really critical. And then once you've made those decisions, it's a lot easier to then focus on the design of the street itself. Again, sort of placing that street design process within the larger context of saying, well, why is the street there, and who's going to be using it, and how do we want them to be using it? Answering all those questions prior to getting into the engineering and architecture of designing an actual street or segment of a street is really critical to making your design work and function properly within that larger system. I'm going to walk through one little case study of a project I finished, I guess, about a year and a half, 2 years ago now, and I'm kind of pleased because it seems to be getting implemented, and it's kind of exciting to see it happen. This is a small community in Central Virginia in the mountains of the Blue Ridge, a little city of Stanton, historic city that's just 3 miles from an interstate exchange. And they wanted to try to design a corridor plan that was going to really improve both the community character and provide the kinds of transportation choices that really express the kind of livable community goals that we've been talking about throughout this whole seminar. So the recommendations out of this planning process, and we used the context-sensitive solutions approach to help structure it, really encompassed a lot of what we're talking about, both putting in those multimodal improvements, but also looking at character enhancements. And one of the most important elements to it was the fact that we really had to understand that Richmond Road corridor, which is the sort of white road running through the very center of your screen, as a corridor that is surrounded by a network of other streets that combined, that really makes your corridor, and that all of those streets combined, whether they exist today or not, really exist to make the entire corridor function properly. So we identified several context zones just within this. Again, it's a pretty short stretch of roadway, but it really does change context very quickly from a very historic urban center at the western end, where you can see the village of Stanton and the city of Stanton, all the way to the sort of big box and interstate area, and even out to the further into a rural section. All of this sort of takes place within just a few miles, and it's important to get the design of the street and the surrounding environment designed in a way that's going to support those kinds of environments that the community wants to promote. So down in that urban gateway section, we really focused on having the pedestrians accessing the corridor, making the corridor really part of the urban fabric. And then as we moved towards a slightly less heavy urban and intense urban environment, more of a local shopping and neighborhood area, we found there was a real need to fill in the street grid around the corridor. It doesn't have to be to the same intensity as the urban center, but it does need to have more logic and connectivity to it. And by so doing, we can begin to improve the functionality of the main street by removing some of the traffic lights that are causing congestion and backups, and creating an opportunity for transit. And then as we get into the more regional service area, the big box areas, we're beginning to approach, as you can see in this picture, the interstate. The traffic starts to want to move a little more quickly. It's serving a different context, and we found the need to begin to pull the pedestrians and the bicyclists even more fully onto that network until you got to the area where it was fully intersected with the interstate, at which point, you really don't want to have bicyclists and pedestrians. That's one place where you don't want. The complete street does not involve having bicyclists and pedestrians on the corridor. Fortunately, this area already had a through street that had been constructed privately underneath the interstate that served very well as a bicycle and pedestrian connector. But it really was a good planning exercise and process to understand the overlay and the connections, the overlaps and connections between the different networks and mode sheds, just as Chris was talking about in real life here. And then the corridor winds up becoming much more of a rural parkway at its other end. Two of the things, again, that this plan really relied upon, in addition to looking at the engineering of the main street itself, was making sure that over time the surrounding bicycle and pedestrian and local street network were built properly. One opportunity there that they're exploring is putting a greenway adjacent to a rail line. That's a very hilly, mountainous area, and those 3% grades are terrific. And this is a strategy that's quite doable. It hasn't been done very often in Virginia, but it's been done in other places to put in a greenway right next to a rail line with appropriate separation of the two modes. And then the other thing that the plan relies on very heavily was creating those local street networks in order to, again, not only create a corridor that was really complete, but also to reduce the congestion and distribute the traffic on the existing main corridor, which is constrained by right-of-way. It really can't be widened, and you really don't want to widen it in terms of community character, and yet you want traffic to flow more smoothly. And so one of the other benefits that this local street network being built over time produces is the opportunity to manage the access, as I was saying a minute ago. These little green dots that you see on your screen here along the main corridor are all little driveways in and out, in and out, in and out along the corridor, and there's just tons of them up and down that corridor that are causing all kinds of little backups and little issues that combined can really create some delay. And over time, as those streets get constructed in collaboration with the private sector, redevelopment can occur. The entrances can begin to move towards the back in many cases, and the driveways can start to be closed so that you have better managed access along the main corridor. So we're really meeting both the transportation functionality goal of the main highway with the community character and development and economic development goals of the community by really partnering on creating street networks and multimodal networks that can put all together, make it all work. By using that multimodal approach to integrated land use, it also allowed us to get more creative about what are the funding sources, given that the federal and state departments of transportation are not feeling very wealthy these days. Really looking for creative ways to use little-known programs and other sources to fund some of these transportation investments. And finally, to integrate the directives that matter into the policy and regulatory tools of the community, and they do have an overlay district established for this corridor as well as their other entrance corridors. And they were able to take some of these context-sensitive solutions design concepts and incorporate them right into the code of the overlay district adopted by the community, and now these design guidelines are in fact part of that ordinance and are being used to help guide development. And what you're seeing here on your screen is just a very organized system of design guidelines that's structured right around those realms that I showed you earlier of the context-sensitive solutions approach. Looking at first the four realms, the first one being the context realm that really looks at the area surrounding the street itself, the connectivity of the network surrounding the main corridor, really creating a multimodal network around that corridor and having the scale of the buildings be appropriate and proper, putting the parking and designing the parking in the right places, and then looking inward a little bit at the roadside realm, the pedestrian environment. And again, in this corridor, in some cases, the pedestrians are not supposed to be on the corridor and they're pulled off the corridor. In other places, we deliberately put the pedestrians right on the corridor. And so transitioning from one place to another was important to understand. We also have these guidelines in here from, again, that coordinated context-sensitive solutions approach that includes engineering and architecture, guidance about how to design an inviting street wall that's really appropriate to the kind of, again, pedestrian activity you want to create, whether it's oriented towards the street or whether it's oriented towards the local network off the street. And then finally, what they call the travelway realm, which is what most people think of when they're thinking about designing a roadway or a street segment, is what's happened between the curbs. And here looking at, where do you want to put in medians and elements that both provide community character enhancements but also provide practical resources like pedestrian refuge areas and splitting up a wide intersection crossing and so forth, and putting in transit and bicycle room for transit and cyclists. And then the last realm that the context-sensitive solutions process looks at, and they structure it itself, is the intersection realm because it's so complex. They have sort of a whole series of guidance that we were able to draw from on how to design some of the crosswalks in those pedestrian-oriented areas and how to use techniques like roundabouts to be able to move traffic better in some of those urban gateway areas. So we're just about at the conclusion of what we're presenting today. We've shared an awful lot of information with you, and I hope it's been helpful. And I just wanted to close with reminding ourselves about what is our job when we are making transportation systems that foster livable communities. We are creating transportation systems that provide the connections the community needs to survive. We're providing transportation systems that provide the connections people need in order to thrive. We're providing transportation connections that allow every person to achieve the purpose of every trip. And we're providing transportation connections that allow people to travel safely and conveniently and comfortably and affordably, both today and for generations to come. It's kind of perhaps a tall order, perhaps, and sometimes you might wonder if we can do it, and I just wanted to provide an inspirational message about the concept of whether it's impossible. As you all may know, according to all known laws of aviation, the bee should not be able to fly because its wings are too small to get its fat little body off the ground. But the bee, of course, flies anyway. And this is because bees don't care what humans think is impossible. I learned that great piece of science from the Bee Movie, of course. But I just wanted to remind us that it's our job to make communities in which people can soar and fly, and I would challenge us all to fly whether or not you think you can. And I would close with that and turn it back over to Glenn.
Thank you, Hannah and Chris. We have about 20 minutes left for some questions and answers. For those of you listening out there, now's a good opportunity to get those questions in if you have not done so already. We'll try to get to as many of these as we can. The first question I have is, how do we make traditional rural village areas with strip development on the exterior more walkable, bikeable, pedestrian friendly?
Well, I would say if you remember back the little slides I had about the settlement pattern in the town of Orange, Virginia. Orange is a classic example of what we're talking about in that question. It's a little city of just a few thousand people. It's really a town surrounded by rolling hills and rural areas, and it was created around first a rail line and then a couple of major U.S. highways that come through it. And one of the things we did, actually, that set of slides I was showing you, were from a context-sensitive solution study we did with Orange as part of their zoning ordinance update and as part of a DOT analysis of the U.S. highways that serve as the main street for that town. And we were able to really look at how do you establish essentially sort of multimodal character districts along those corridors and build the network that perhaps isn't quite complete there, or perhaps it has been a little disrupted, and take advantage of the fact that the existing built environment, the existing network in the old town, the fabric is perfectly good. And I think that's the case in most American rural communities. They were built at a time when the fabric was more fine-grained. They may have been just originally served by a transit system. So you've got almost always really good bones there. And what's often occurred, as occurred in Orange and other places I've worked in rural areas, is the development has sort of leaked out a little bit along the corridors, but in some cases it hasn't sprawled so very far away that it's impossible to begin to create the kind of connections between the original small village and the development that's happening right outside of it, parallel to the corridors, and create those kinds of networks that allow people to make a short drive or a bicycle trip or even a walk trip to some of the new development areas. So I think a lot of it has to do with kind of taking a look at, as Chris was saying, the grids that might be missing but could be there, and just making a few strategic connections to help essentially integrate the newer neighborhoods and development with the older core village. So I think technically that's part of what needs to happen, and I think the other part that needs to happen is we need to make the federal policy live up to its commitment of investing in existing communities. Rural towns and villages were precisely what I believe the federal government and DOT, particularly in HUD, were thinking about when they were creating those livability principles of investing in existing places. So I think that it'd be wise to take advantage of that spirit and try to focus some of the federal and other resources and planning resources towards these rural communities that are in fact the good places and the existing places we ought to be investing in, and begin to put economic energy and transportation investments back into them. So use the leverage you have as a rural community to get livable transportation investments put into your rural community, because that's what it's supposed to do.
Next question. In the absence of transit stops, how do you determine where the central points of the pedestrian mode sheds are located?
I think that's, you look at your existing fabric to get some sort of notion of where it should be. And when I say fabric, I'm talking about the street network, where are the key intersections for the connector streets, and then also the building patterns and how they've oriented themselves. But it's where you want it to be. You define where it could be, where it might be, but it's a very conscientious decision. Where is that place that's going to be the focal point for this particular pedestrian shed, and define it, and then start organizing your street network and your land development regulations accordingly. If you're not going to grow into a transit type of service over the long haul, you don't have to think about it. But I think it's never too early to think about transit connectivity over the long haul and understanding where the alignment might be and how that starts overlapping with these pedestrian sheds that you start defining. But I still think it's a conscientious decision that you make to define where these pedestrian sheds are, locate it, and then start organizing your land use and design guidelines around those places on the map.
And I think what I've learned from you, Chris, especially too in this presentation, is paying attention to that framework of the larger, higher mobility streets that need to frame your community or your place that either does exist or that you're hoping to create, so that you're allowing the through network streets to perform their function, and then you're locating the pedestrian sheds and the smaller scale, finer grained areas inside of that, and allow those to be edges rather than trying to turn them into centers. If there's a main street, a U.S. highway that is in fact the center of a village, then I think one has to zoom out and think about, well, where is the larger mobility sort of context for this place so that that street really can function properly as a center, and if it can't, then make a decision to move the center. That's what we did in Crozet, for instance, where we found that you really needed to slightly shift the center a little bit.
Crozet, Virginia.
To make it work, yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I think that's part of the equation too that one needs to look at.
Next question. Can you address the importance of school location in these plans and the ability of kids to walk and bike to school?
Yeah, I think, as I said, the pedestrian shed at the neighborhood level, when you're thinking about what connects these different pedestrian sheds together, it's probably not going to be significant retail. Retail just can't get spread so thinly. But what are good centering devices for these neighborhood sheds are parks, are schools. I think everybody's wrestled with the large school footprint, and how do you deal with that is a different issue. But I think schools and parks are the appropriate neighborhood centering devices.
And there are resources out there. It's been a few years now, and I'm blanking out. I'll have to remember it later and send it to you. But there's a set of guidelines for designing public schools, in particular public facilities, with smaller footprints, specifically for that idea of either restoring and reinventing or designing new neighborhood-oriented schools that are walkable like this. And I'm blanking out on what it is, but there's an organization that does provide the
the safe routes to schools?
It's not safe routes to schools. This is actually a set of guidelines that's used by public works and school planning officials. I bet one of those 500 people out there probably knows what I'm talking about, so you can email it in if you remember it. But there is information out there that
it's the CEFPTI Center for Educational Facility Planners.
Yes, thank you, whoever that was that put that in there. That's a resource that people really ought to tap into because it could help you as a planner deal with the fact of the pressure to site a school far away from the neighborhood because of the large lot size you need and all the land you need for your playing fields and so forth. That's a resource that could be very helpful. There's also a nice book available in New Jersey. They had a program to promote schools as centers of communities and have done a lot of work towards that end, so I would encourage you to look at what New Jersey's Department of Transportation and their Department of Community Planning have come up with at that state scale to promote and resolve the barriers to really designing schools within a good street network that's accessible.
Next question. I have a historic business district of a small community connected to an interstate by a 1-mile corridor of strip development. Lots of blacktops, lots of left turn intersections, lots of through traffic. How do I make this corridor safer and more pleasant?
Well, I'd invite you to call Amy Arnold, who worked with us on that Richmond Road study. She about 2.5 or 3 miles to play with between her historic town and the interstate, but it was a somewhat similar situation. And I think what you're going to find, particularly with all those sort of backups and bottlenecks and rear-ending crashes and so forth that are probably occurring because of the driveways, is that it's going to require a process of figuring out, perceiving that corridor as something larger than just the street within the right-of-way, and really looking at developing some alternative transportation networks that connect to it more strategically and allow you over time to close some of those driveways and reorient your development. I don't think it's an easy process to do overnight, obviously, but it took us a little while to get into this sort of kind of situation. It's going to take us a little while to get out of it. But Big Box does have to redevelop at some point, and that's the time to take advantage of the fact that it's all already paved and those parking lots could become street networks.
Next question. Chris, this is for you. Being from Orlando, you know that it is an automobile-dominant community. Based on these concepts, how do you convince state and local government decision makers it is a wise investment to implement plans for a light rail system to improve connectivity among Central Florida communities, reduce our reliance on cars, and become more energy efficient?
Well, I may offend some people.
A simple question, yes.
Yeah. we have a governor right now who is working very much against that goal. The state had, I think, $3 billion in federal money to build high-speed rail connection between Orlando and Tampa. And that was pretty much going to fund the entire system, and the governor decided to send the money back to the federal government, much to the joy of California and other places. So we lost out on that opportunity. There's also, it's been designed, it's ready to be constructed, the Sunrail commuter rail system that goes down the I-4 corridor in Orlando. The only thing it needs is final approval from the governor to get built, and we're all crossing our fingers to see if he'll actually allow that funding to happen or not. We'll see. Orlando's trying. I think state of Florida is trying, but every time we get fairly close to the ring, it gets snatched away from us. So there's a strong. Bottom line is there's a strong sentiment, I think, in Orlando to do things differently, and hopefully, if the Sunrail system gets built, that'll start changing the tide.
Okay, there's a number of questions here. I'm going to try to aggregate them concerning retrofitting and perhaps promoting land use and transportation concepts and connectivity in existing communities with the perhaps broader objective of not only retrofitting but promoting redevelopment and revitalization. Could you expand upon those concepts a little bit? How do you approach the retrofitting of established areas?
I think there's more opportunity than a lot of people think there is, especially in old, I'll call them older, even some of the newer suburban areas. I'm not talking about subdivisions, but some of those areas where there were shopping centers or there were office parks. There's actually more opportunity to change things than I think initially meets the eye. And I can't tell you where you can find this resource, but probably the classic example of this at a very large scale is the Tyson's Corner area that I mentioned earlier. It has been redesigned to make it more walkable, to make it more transit friendly, to make it more connected. And again, maybe somebody out in the audience has the connection into that plan, but a plan was done for Tyson's Corner, which I've seen, and I thought it looked pretty elegant in terms of how they are proposing to transform this place into something different. And it does happen. It's happened in here in Orlando with the redevelopment of some of the areas just around downtown Orlando into very walkable places. And if we can do it in Orlando, it probably can be done in a lot of different places. Though, as you're, again, getting back to, I'll keep beating the drum for transit and trying to figure out how transit works. Transit is, you just can't lay down transit anywhere. You've got to really think through where the alignment's going to go and how it's going to connect to different places as it goes along a particular corridor. So don't forget about the opportunities to connect a place that you're trying to redevelop to other places along a corridor via transit, and really take that fairly seriously in a detailed level of detail, at a detailed level, so that you don't preclude that opportunity to make a transit connection in the future.
And I think that even just doing the theoretical exercise of as if you were planning for transit provides a tremendous amount of information and planning resources for you to plan a well-connected community, because we have a great number of well-connected communities today that used to have transit that don't have transit anymore, such as Richmond and the Fan District that Chris was talking about. That was the first trolley city in America, and that urban design still works beautifully, even though at the moment there's a very good bus transit system, but there's not as much as there could be there. So I think you know, it's okay to plan for transit and not have the transit right away, and you can even secretly plan for transit and not tell anybody you're doing that, but use the same techniques to plan for a better designed, better connected community. I think the other thing I would think about too that I've really picked up from some of the ideas Chris has been sharing about kind of understanding the intensities and the needs for connectivity and how they change. It's not necessary for everywhere to be utterly walkable and totally connected to everywhere else. It's, you know, it's I think for, you know, if you have a shopping mall area, big box strip area, and you've got, you know, subdivisions a couple of miles away, you know, it may not be necessary, at least not right away, to try to connect those subdivisions into the shopping big box center. For one thing, the people are going to hate you for doing that. But more importantly, it might be more important just to create the connected network of interparcel access between the shopping centers first and get that sort of framework down. And then the connections to the larger residential areas outside of that sort of zone, you know, may occur over time, but they may not. Either way, you know, you're creating places that one can navigate more efficiently, and then you're creating a better sort of network of higher level connections in between those places. But I think it's important not to sort of try to be a fanatic and think I've just got to make everybody walk everywhere throughout the 20 square miles of my community. So I think it's helpful to take some of the hierarchy concepts that Chris put together and some of the travel shed concepts and overlay them on the places you're thinking about retrofitting to kind of figure out where the strategic connections could be made that are going to get you the most value in terms of a better network.
Okay, we're getting pretty close to 2:30. I think we have time for one more question, and then let me see here. Let's try this one. How can we as planners work even more effectively with our engineering community, our traffic engineers, our transportation engineers, to foster a better connectivity between land use and transportation?
Well, I think gosh, that's that's a 2-hour seminar. I think one of the big challenges out there for everybody is more integrated planning across the board. You know, I think land use planners have got to understand some of the technical requirements behind transportation, whether it be roads or transit. On the engineering side, I think they've got to understand land uses and some of the limitations and possibilities on the land use side as well. So just, you know, being able to understand, you know, just being able to put things together in a more holistic way is extremely important. But there's one thing in particular that I want to say, and that is just this, you know, take the focus away from the facility itself and really start thinking more about networks and how networks get put together, because urban areas are fabrics. They're not lines on a map, they're fabrics, and that fabric needs to be connected in some way, shape, or form. So it's really about network, and let's think about network capacity. Let's think about network continuity and connectivity as we engineer these and plan for these places.
And I would definitely echo that, Chris. I think that we as planners have kind of abdicated a leadership role we really need to step up and take. I mean, engineers are people who love to make things work. They like to engineer things. They want to construct stuff that functions. That's not the same job as a planner who sees the whole and synthesizes all the elements and is able to stand back and look at the big picture and perceive the fabric that needs to be woven on the loom. That's a different job. And over the last 50 years or so, as planning has been dominated by the transportation element of our disciplines, partly just because that's where the money was to do planning consistently. We've put engineers in a very difficult position where quite often they've been forced to try to figure out what the plan for the community is, or try to do their best to understand what the fabric is that they're supposed to be weaving this street functionality into. I think if the planner can do our work to educate ourselves, use the APA transportation planning credit process and take that exam. Educate yourself about the language of engineering to the level you need to in order to communicate better and provide the engineers with the right direction they need to build the house that you've designed.
Well, with that, I just want to thank you guys so much for giving today's presentation. For those of you still in attendance, I'm just going to go over a few final details. To log CM credit for attending today's session, you'll just need to go to www.planning.org/CM, select activities by date, and then underneath Friday, June 3rd, you'll see Livable Communities, Sustainable Regions. And like I said, this is up already, so once you log it up here, you can go ahead and go and log those credits. And also, we are recording today's session, so you'll be able to find a video recording and a PDF of today's webinar at www.utah-apa.org/webcast-archive, and this should be up by Monday. And with that, I would just like to conclude today's session, and just another thank you out to the APA Virginia chapter for sponsoring today's session, and with the help of Glenn, Chris, and Hannah for giving today's presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.